Hey, Gary.
Hey, Jason.
Gary, will there be any lions tonight?
Yes.
More lions?
More lions.
Oh,
Lions
boy.
and panthers and bears. Oh my.
Bears?
Yeah.
The bear is kind of hungry tonight, too, as
He
I
is a
remember.
hungry bear. And he's not like those lions. They get caught up without even trying. All tangled. Hey, Jason.
Yes, Gary.
We have been taking pictures for the directory.
Check.
Did you know that?
Yes, I had heard that. I'd heard a rumor.
And I had to do a selfie.
Yes, you did it. Wait a minute. That's not a selfie of you.
Was that a selfie of you?
That was, that's my doppelganger.
Yeah. Well, no. I thought you said Peter Sellers.
No, not Peter Sellers, Tom Selleck.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
I thought you said Peter Sellers.
Although he's a handsome man.
He is a handsome man.
Yeah.
The mustache is kind of the same. But
I must ask you a question.
I was able to get a picture of somebody famous.
Oh, yes. That's
Bubba Fish.
Bubba Fish. Gary. My goodness.
We're gonna
That is disturbing.
Well, we're going to see some scary things tonight. And I thought we might as well set the stage for some of the scary creatures we're going to be seeing. I wanted to wait till the kids were gone because it scares the children.
You're gonna
see that.
Here eventually we're gonna see Daniel's knees knocking together like Belshazzar's were, and I think
Yeah.
you make your Photoshop privileges have been revoked.
Oh man. Oh well.
You know my mother watches these. Can you put that picture on there? Come on.
This,
No, it won't. No, it won't. It's frozen. It won't move.
it did an update, and now it's being weird.
Now we're stuck looking at that all evening.
Oh, it'll go from that. That's no problem.
Okay. Oh, okay.
But it won't go here.
It won't go.
Okay.
I don't know.
I'm going to have to catch up here.
I think there might be some gingivitis going on there.
Check. We're going to have to do this. We have to do this manually, I think, because something
You're not going to have to resort to
broke
the
down.
Trackpad.
I'm not surprised that wrecked it.
Well, it broke the camera when you
It
took
broke
the picture,
everything.
didn't it?
So what do we have left to talk about tonight?
The end of the world, I think.
There's nothing on the screen, is there? Oh,
Well, we can
man.
see it.
It looks good. You want to look on my laptop? Let's see what I'm going to do here. Talk amongst yourselves.
This happens to me sometimes during the middle of math class.
Does it?
Yep, technology falls apart.
We'll have to start over with Peter
No.
Peter Sellers.
See if it might crash again.
Right. Hey, you know what I discovered like yesterday or the day before?
What's that?
That Amy and I are in Praise and Harmony tape
Amy,
recording.
you are on a Praise and Harmony recording?
Yes.
How'd that happen?
Well,
How
we
did
didn't
you-
know it.
how
It
did
was
you-
it was at the Sunset Workshop.
Oh, okay.
And our faces aren't in there, but our voices are. And we'll have to play that for you sometime. Does that look familiar?
There, that looks more better.
It was going to be a long night, folks. We are actually going from a historical section of Daniel into a prophetic or apocalyptic part of Daniel. The first six chapters are historical. Those are just an account of what was happening. But we're actually going to be going back in time from where we left off. And as we go into Daniel chapter 7, we're going to get into the prophetic part of the book that gets into all these visions. And it begins with an introduction of four great beasts. And it says, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions in his mind as he lay on his bed. Then he wrote the dream down and related the following summary of it. Daniel said, I was looking in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. And four great beasts were coming up from the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had the wings of an eagle. I kept looking until its wings were plucked, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. A human mind also was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one, resembling a bear, and it was raised up on one side, and 3 ribs were in its mouth between its teeth. And thus they said to it, Arise, devour much meat. After this I kept looking, and behold, another one, like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrifying and extremely strong, and it had large iron teeth. It devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet. And it was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. While I was contemplating the horns, behold, another horn, a little one, came up among them. And 3 of the first horns were pulled out by the roots before it. And behold, this horn possessed eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth uttering great boasts. This vision takes place in the first year of Belshazzar. Remember, we ended up in the last year of Belshazzar.
Mm-hmm.
That would have been somewhere around 553 BC. Remember, we said that Belshazzar really wasn't number 1 in the kingdom. And in Daniel, he's referred to as the king, but historically, he's never referred to as the king in any of the official documents, because his father, Nabonidus, was actually the king, and he left Belshazzar in charge. While he went off for about 10 years, he changed the religion. They had a single god it was their major god, and he changed it to the sun god, made him very unpopular with a lot of people. But he is the first archaeologist. He was rebuilding a lot of shrines and temples and things, and in order to do that, he went and did digs in the previous spots, and so he's considered the first archaeologist. So Nabonidus left Belshazzar in charge while he went off for about 10 years. And then he probably came back for about 3 or 4 years because the enemy was approaching Babylon, and he knew that they were coming, and so he went back. And his reign ended, and Belshazzar's reign ended on October the 12th of 539 BC.
That's very specific. That
is very specific. But we're back at the first year of Belshazzar when this vision happened in about 553 BC. It says that Daniel wrote the dream down and he related the summary. And so it was important to him to make a record of it. We mentioned last time that Nebuchadnezzar wrote things down and put them in the official record so that they'd be remembered, and they were so important. And what Daniel sees is 4 great beasts, and each one is different. And if you think what we saw previously was scary, that's nothing compared to this. That one picture of that one Bubba guy wasn't nearly as scary as this. Now, the 4 winds of heaven are stirring up the great sea. Oftentimes in the Bible, wind represents God's action. One example of that is Jesus talking to Nicodemus in John chapter 3, where Nicodemus is having trouble understanding what Jesus is saying to him. And Jesus says, Do not marvel that I said to you, you must be born again. The wind blows where it wishes, and you hear the sound of it, but do not know where it comes from and where it is going. So is everyone who is born of the Spirit. You remember that when God dried up the sea so they could walk by it, he used a wind to do that. And quite often God uses a great wind to accomplish his action. And the sea often refers to the peoples, to a large group of humanity. And one example of that is in Isaiah 17, where it says in verses 12 and 13, Alas, the uproar of many peoples who roar like the roaring of the seas, and the rumbling of nations who rush on like the rumbling of mighty waters. The nations rumble on like the rumbling of many waters, but he will rebuke them, and they will flee away. And he chased like chaff in the mountains before the wind, and be chased like chaff in the mountains before the wind, or like whirling dust before a gale. And so the wind, which is God's action, is stirring up the seas, which is stirring up the peoples and causing these things to happen. The first creature he sees is a lion with wings of an eagle. His wings are plucked, and he's lifted up off from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet. And it's interesting because I suspect some people out there, since we're talking about four creatures, might be able to figure out already what they represent, because this isn't the first time we've seen 4 somethings. And so if this is the first of the 4, I wonder what the lion with the wings would represent. Jason knows.
Babylon.
Babylon, the first kingdom. Remember that statue that had the 4 parts? And it represents Babylon. It's interesting because Nebuchadnezzar had the opposite thing happen to him. He went from 2 feet to 4. But here this lion is lifted up off the ground and made to stand on 2 feet, and he becomes the primary power at that time. But then there was a bear who was raised up on one side and had 3 ribs between his teeth, and he was told to arise and devour much meat. And we have the Medo-Persian Empire, because it was a combination of the Medes and the Persians, but the Persians were really dominant. They were the main force. And so it was a lopsided arrangement. And so this bear is lopsided. One side is higher than the other, and that'd be the Persian side. The 3 ribs probably don't mean anything specific other than just a lot of, 3's a total number. Mm-hmm. He has all these ribs between his teeth, and he's given the instruction, go get some more. Mm-hmm. By the time we get through eating 3 racks of ribs, we're probably pretty full. But he's to go out and do more damage, go out and arise and devour much meat. And that would represent, I already told it, I gave it away, because I said what the bear was.
You did.
It is the Medo-Persian Empire. Well, what's the third one going to be then? You have the Babylonians and the Medo-Persians, and you have the Greeks.
They're good.
They know the answers. That's a smart crew. And he's given the 4 wings of a bird, and 4 heads, and dominion is given. And we'll see later on that Alexander the Great went through and basically conquered the whole world in 3 years. Mm-hmm. But after he died, things fell apart, and his kingdom split up between 4 of his generals. And so it was fine while things lasted, but within a short time it was split up into 4 different groups. So if you have the Babylonians and the Medo-Persians and the Greeks, the 4th kingdom to come along in that statue is the Romans. Now this isn't a lion or a bear or a leopard. This thing is just scary, and it's described as being dreadful and terrifying. It is extremely strong. It has large iron teeth, and it devours and crushes and tramples down, and it's different from all the others. And it has 10 horns. And there's so much in Daniel that is very identical to what's in the Romans or in Revelation. That's why we're studying all these together, because a lot of the images in Revelation come from these books, Ezekiel and Daniel. And so this is a picture we're going to see again, the horns and the heads and all those. We're going to see that in Revelation. But then there was another horn that came up among the 10 horns, and it was a little horn. And 3 of the first horns were pulled out by the roots before it, and this one possessed eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth uttering great boasts. So this is scary. They have these horn coming up among the 10 horns, and it has eyes, and it can speak. It has a mouth, and it rips out 3 of the other horns, and it's just a scary creature. There were 10 Caesars up through Titus: Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, Galba, Otto, Vitellius, Vespasian, and Titus. Vespasian's son was Titus, and then Vespasian had a second son who took over after Titus, and his name was Domitian. And he was the 11th. Mm-hmm. And he was the bad guy. Nero was just wacky, but Domitian was just evil. And here we have 11 kings, 11 heads. In Revelation we have 8. And that may be the reason for the 3, deposing the 3, because you take 11 and subtract 3, you get back to 8. And the significance of 8 is it is the number of resurrection. It's a number often applied to Jesus. If this is someone who's trying to assume the role of Jesus, then he would be a number 8, because 8 is the day of you have 7 days, and the 8th day is the first day of the next week, and so 8 is a number that often is used for Jesus. But Domitian, he was just evil. William Barclay said, with the coming of Domitian, there came a complete change. Domitian was a devil. He was the worst of all things, a cold-blooded persecutor. With the exception of the mad Caligula, he was the first emperor to take his divinity seriously and to demand Caesar worship. When he arrived in the theater with his empress, the crowds were urged to rise and shout, "All hail to our Lord and his lady," and he enacted that he himself was a god. Others had kind of toyed with the idea, and they accepted it if it was given, but they didn't really go out and demand it. But Domitian did. And so he was the 11th emperor, and he went out and demanded that he be treated as God. And so you hear that you have this beast, which is Rome after Greece, and you have the 10 heads, and then the 11th head is the one that does all this damage. But then in the next verses, 9 through 12, we are introduced to the Ancient of Days. And notice the contrast here between these four beasts and what's happening next, what's really going on. He said, I kept looking until thrones were set up, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His vesture was like white snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was ablaze with flames. Its wheels were a burning fire. A river of fire was flowing and coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands were attending him, and myriads upon myriads were standing before him. The court sat, and the books were opened. Then I kept looking because of the sound of the boastful words which the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain, and its body was destroyed and given to the burning fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but an extension of life was granted to them for an appointed period of time. The Ancient of Days takes his seat. I wonder who the Ancient of Days would be. Be God, who is really ancient because he never had a beginning. He always has been, he always is, he just is. And he is the Ancient of Days. He sets up thrones, and we don't know what those are. They may be for the saints or for the 24 or 12 that we see in the book of Revelation, but he takes his seat, and he's dressed like white snow, and his hair's like pure wool, which is pretty much exactly what we see in some of the imagery in the book of Revelation. The white clothing and the hair like pure wool is exactly the same. And his throne is blazing. These things have to be described in human words because that's all we have. But I think they probably come short into really showing the whole picture. That if you think of something just totally ablaze and how bright that is, that's nothing compared to what he saw, I don't think. That's as close as we can come. And he mentions wheels and burning fire. And we saw in Ezekiel that God's throne was like a chariot. It had wheels. And this throne has wheels. And it's bright and burning like fire. And there's a river of fire that comes out from underneath it. And so there's the contrast between those beasts and then the Ancient of Days and his throne. And thousands and myriads of people stand before him. And this court sits and the books are open. There again, we're back in Revelation. And they're considering his boastful words, and Daniel was considering his boastful words. And you remember all those non-battles we have in the Bible? The books are opened and the beast is slain. His body is destroyed and thrown into the fire. Dominion is taken away, but life is granted for a appointed period of time. The Roman Empire just disintegrated. It fell apart. They started hiring mercenaries who didn't really care about defending the country. They just cared about getting paid. And so the Roman Empire drug on, but it was chaos. It was nothing like it was the first century. And so they continued, the emperors continued to rule, but it was not orderly. And then in the next two verses, we're introduced to another character, and that is, yes.
What time period, do we know what time period he's talking about? What was the time period? Do we know the time period that he reigned?
That Domitian reigned? Toward the end of the first century.
About the time of the writing of the book of Revelation.
Yeah, about the time of the writing of the book of Revelation. After the destruction of Jerusalem, or at the same time of the destruction of Jerusalem in 72 AD.
That was Titus.
And Titus did that, and then Domitian. There's an arch like that. Those arches in Rome. They would come back and they have a triumphal parade, and they build these arches for them to go through. And the Arch of Titus is still standing in Rome, and it actually shows people carrying the candlestick from the temple, and so the Arch of Titus is still there in Rome. But we're talking the last quarter of the first century. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
We're introduced then to the Son of Man, and Daniel says, "I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, the clouds of heaven, one like a Son of Man was coming, and it came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. When we saw that statue, and the gold and the silver and the bronze and the iron, but what happened to that statue?
Got crunched.
It got crunched, but how did a big old boulder fall on its head, or what happened to it?
It was cast.
There was a little rock cut out of the mountain that came and hit it on its feet, and it brought the whole thing down. And what happened to that little rock? It grew and grew and grew and filled the whole earth. And so what we're seeing is what was predicted before to Nebuchadnezzar, but it's presented in a different way. But it's the same situation. This one is coming with clouds, which again we see in the book of Revelation. It's not uncommon to see God riding on the clouds or carrying out his justice on clouds. And in Revelation we see the same thing. And there's one like a son of man who is presented before the Ancient of Days, and to him is given dominion and glory and a kingdom. And he's served by all the peoples and the nations and languages. And his kingdom is everlasting, it won't pass away, and it will not be destroyed. And that is the kingdom of Jesus, and that is what we're part of. That is the church. It is an everlasting kingdom that will not pass away, it will not be destroyed. But just notice the contrast there, the continuing contrast between those four beasts, how look so powerful and so mean. But look how easily God deals with them and creates a kingdom that will survive those and will not pass away. We're talking 2,000 years ago when these kingdoms met their end, and we're still going. And ours goes on into eternity. You can imagine if you just had this dream last night, you'd be just a little bit distressed. And one thing that we're going to see in this last part of Daniel is he looks for answers, interpretations. Mm-hmm. John does the same thing in the book of Revelation. He asks for what things mean. And so Daniel wants to know what this all means. We have the benefit of hindsight, and we can go back and read the story. I'm sure you remembered about the dream about the idol, but the statue. But we have the benefit of hindsight and going back and studying these things. But it says, as for me, Daniel, my spirit was distressed within me, and the visions in my mind kept alarming me. I approached one of those who were standing by and began asking him the exact meaning of all this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of these things. These great beasts, which are four in number, are four kings who will arise from the earth, but the saints of the highest one will receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, for all ages to come. His spirit was distressed. He was really upset. He knew it was important, and he knew God was communicating something to him. And he was upset because he didn't really understand what was going on. And so he approached one of those who was standing by in this vision, and it was explained to him these four beasts represent four kings. And each of those kings represents a kingdom. You have Nebuchadnezzar and Darius, and so forth, Alexander the Great. But the saints of the highest one will receive a kingdom forever that will last through all ages. And again, we have the benefit of hindsight, but he's only toward the beginning of the second of those kingdoms. Mm-hmm. And God is showing him what's going to happen throughout the rest of BC, clear on into AD. And he's glad to have that explanation. Daniel still is struggling to understand that fourth beast. That fourth beast was just terrifying. And so he wants some more details about that fourth beast. And he said, I desired to know the exact meaning of the fourth beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its claws of bronze, and which devoured, crushed, and trampled down the remainder with its feet. And the meaning of the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up, and before which 3 of them fell, namely that horn which had eyes and a mouth uttering great boasts, and which was larger in appearance than its associates. I kept looking, and that horn was waging war with the saints and overpowering them until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was passed in favor of the saints of the highest one. And the time arrived when the saints took possession of the kingdom. Thus he said, the fourth beast will be a fourth kingdom on the earth, which will be different from the other kingdoms, and it will devour the whole earth and tread it down, and crush it. He really wanted to know exactly what that fourth beast represented, because it was terrifying, it was dreadful, and especially the horns, the 10 horns and that other horn that came up. And it was waging war with the saints and overpowering them. And of course, Rome did gain power over the church for a while. They persecuted the church. And it looked like they were going to be victorious until the Ancient of Days stepped in and the saints took possession. And as I say, 2,000 years later, look who's still standing. But they thought they had wiped us out, but with persecution came growth. And that fourth beast is going to be the fourth kingdom, which again, of course, is Rome. And then he goes on to explain the 10 horns. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom, 10 kings will arise, and another will arise after them, and he will be different from the previous ones and will subdue 3 kings. And he will speak out against the Most High and wear down the saints of the Highest One. And he will intend to make alterations in times and in law, and they will be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. But the court will sit for judgment, and its dominion will be taken away, annihilated, and destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty, the dominion, the greatness of all the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be given to the people of the saints of the Highest One. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all the dominions will serve and obey him. At this point, the revelation ended. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts were greatly alarming me, and my face grew pale, but I kept the matter to myself. And so we had Belshazzar before with his knees knocking together. Here, Daniel, he's just pale with all this is being revealed to him. What's that? Right, the ones before, he was called on to share with Nebuchadnezzar and explain it, and then in turn it was explained to all the people. This is obviously something he's holding to himself, because this is during the first year of Belshazzar's reign, and it would be 13 or 14 years later when Belshazzar was having that party and invited Daniel in, and because his grandmother told him to, but he didn't seem to know much about Daniel. And I don't think he really cared much about Daniel. So Daniel didn't have an opportunity to share with somebody who didn't care about it. He said, I knew, but he really knew after his grandmother. It's one of those things where you kind of set the stage to suit you. So yeah, he said, I'm familiar with you, I'm acquainted with you, and that's probably superficially true. But as far as really knowing who he was the way Nebuchadnezzar knew he was, he probably came up a little bit short. Counted and weighed and came up a little bit short in the balance. But you're right. Probably 14 years have passed between this and the time when Belshazzar meets his fate. And Daniel doesn't have anybody to talk to. I mean, maybe Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but none of the other officials want to hear what he has to say about it. And so, again, 10 kings will arise, and then there'll be another one come after them who will be different from the previous one. He will subdue 3 kings, speak out against the Most High, and wear down the saints of the Highest One. And he intends to make alterations in times and law to change everything to suit him. And it's given into his hand for time, times, and half a times. And that's another thing that's going to be common in the book of Revelation. And what does 7 represent? If you run across the word 7 in prophetic language, it's a complete number. And so, what's 3.5?
Not complete.
And not complete. You cut 7.5, and you get 3.5. And so it's a limited thing. And if 7 is complete and total, 7 or 3.5 is not. It's a broken 7. Mm-hmm. And so a time, and then times, which is 2. 1 time, 2 times, and a half a time is 3.5 times. And so it's given into his hand, but it's on a limited basis. Mm-hmm. And so that's the time and times, half a time. And we often run into that in the book of Revelation, where you have 3.5, or sometimes it's number of days, which is 3.5 years. And, but the meaning's all the same. It's just a limited time, and the limit is set by God. The court sits for judgment, and the dominion is taken away, annihilated, destroyed forever. The sovereignty, dominion, and greatness of all kingdoms are given to the people of the saints of the Highest One. An everlasting kingdom, and all dominions will serve and obey him. And of course, there will be a day, Philippians 2 tells us, when every knee will bow. But even today, the saints really have all the power. We don't feel that sometimes, but we have the power to carry the gospel message, the blood of Jesus, and that's the only power there is in the whole world that really matters. 100 years from now, there's nothing that's going to matter except the blood of Jesus. It doesn't matter if you have an atomic bomb or a killer virus or whatever you have. 100 years from now, it's not going to make any difference. All that's going to matter is the power of the blood of Jesus, and we have that power. His thoughts were greatly alarmed. His face grew pale, and he just had to keep it to himself. I don't even know if he probably didn't even feel like sharing it because it was so, I don't know, not depressing, but it's just a really deep thing happening to him. What's that? Yeah, and I'm sure he understood where they came from because he was in the habit of receiving that. So I'm sure he knew where they came from. And what do you do with this if nobody cares? And for the time being, he keeps the matter to himself. He did write it down, but he doesn't go around spreading it. And so there are those four beasts. So what do we have next?
A bit.
Daniel made a connection with the one that the great Nebuchadnezzar had this. These visions here.
You wonder.
Whether or not they were.
Yeah.
They represent the same thing.
You wonder. By the time Jason's turn comes around, though, it'll be clear to him, and if he didn't understand it before, he will, because Jason will explain it to him here in a minute. Mike, did you have a?
Yeah, on the 10 horns, so are they considered what? Part of the hierarchy
of Rome, and there are two ways to look at that. There were 10 emperors before Domitian came along as the 11th one. Augustus was the first one, and Domitian was the 11th one. So literally, that's true. But it could also just represent 10 as a power, not as an abstract, not as a fixed number, but not necessarily. It just so happens that the emperors fit that number. But I think the important thing probably is the 10 itself.
Some of the stuff that I had run across had indicated that they were actually 10 peoples.
Yeah, and that's another theory, but they're specifically described as kings and not kingdoms. And so that's one reason to think that they probably were represented kings and not groups. You get into a lot of premillennial things, and there they get into peoples and individual kingdoms and so forth. But based on the language, it was probably kings and not groups of people. There are a lot of people who feel that's the correct thing. But as I say, the 10 happen to fit. But I wouldn't be real dogmatic about it because since it's prophetic language, if someone wanted to say the 10 represents a lot of power, I'd sure buy that too.
I think one of the things that we struggle with in the interpretation of Daniel and Ezekiel and Revelation is that we get glimpses where the Bible interprets itself for us, as it does for a portion of the vision in Daniel 7 and a portion of the vision in Daniel 8. Daniel is given some very specific meanings for some portions of his vision, and that leaves us wanting more specific interpretation for the rest of the vision that is not specifically explained by the scriptures itself. And so when we get a glimpse of something that suggests, okay, these 10 things line up nicely here, well then what can we start lining other things up with and making those things fit historical statements when we haven't been given that information by the scriptures itself. And I think that's where we have to be careful trying to force an interpretation on some of the things that the scriptures haven't interpreted for us.
And it's not unheard of in books of prophecy to have a mixture of historical and apocalyptic.
Right.
And it'll go back and forth, and that can be confusing sometimes, trying to weigh out when is he being historical and when is he being apocalyptic. And Alexander's kingdom breaking up into 4 parts is just literally true. That's what happened. The bear being taller on one side than the other is what happened. But again, the question is where do we
Where does
make the distinction?
where does the figure end and the literal history
Yeah.
begin? I mean, because there's sometimes some gray area there.
Exactly.
So Daniel 8 is another vision of a couple of beasts. This time we're going to kind of narrow our focus down and not have that wide vision of the 4 successive kingdoms, but we're going to kind of zero in on 2 of the kingdoms, specifically with the vision that Daniel has in this chapter.
And there'll be different creatures.
Different creatures, different symbolism.
It
there
is
we
now.
go.
Symbology is a good word.
Okay.
I like that word.
All right.
In the statue,
Mhm.
they're represented one way.
Right.
And then in chapter 7, they're represented another way. And now you have 2 of them that are going to be represented in still another way.
Right. So the first 2 verses kind of pinpoint for us when this takes place. In the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar the king, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, subsequent to the one which appeared to me previously. And I looked in the vision, and it came about while I was looking that I was in the citadel of Susa, which is in the province of Elam. And I looked in the vision, and I myself was beside the Ulai Canal. So this, he pinpoints it for us. This is 2 years after the vision of chapter 7, after the vision that I had previously. That was his previous vision. He's not referring to a vision that somebody else had that he interpreted. This was his vision that he had in the 1st year of Belshazzar. So this is in the 3rd year of Belshazzar. And Daniel is transported in his vision to the capital city of Susa, which is along the Ulai Canal. And this is the capital city of what kingdom?
Of the Persian kingdom.
Of the Persian kingdom, of the Medes and the Persian kingdom. This is not, under Belshazzar, that's still the Babylonian kingdom.
Mhm.
And so he's not in the capital of Babylon, he's in the capital of the Medes and Persian kingdom now, Susa. He's there by vision, not actually there. Whether or not he ever had been there, we're not really told. We don't know if perhaps on some emissarial trip for the king he had been sent there before. We don't know, but he is there in the vision. And he's along the Ulai Canal. And the Ulai Canal is a historical place that it was a man-made canal that was dug around the city of Susa that brought in water to supply the city and agricultural and those kind of things. So the city of Susa is the place where the events of the book of Esther take place. About 100 years later, after Daniel has this vision, we're down to the time of Esther, and that's where all the events of that book take place. So that's during the reign of the Medes and Persians. So now the vision that Daniel has, verses 3 through 14, and this is just the vision in total here. If you haven't read it, this is the vision that he has. Then I lifted my gaze and looked, and behold, a ram which had 2 horns was standing in front of the canal. Now the 2 horns were long, but one was longer than the other, with the longer one coming up last. I saw the ram butting westward, northward, and southward, and no other beast could stand before him. Nor was there anyone to rescue from his power, but he did as he pleased and magnified himself. While I was observing, behold, a male goat was coming from the west over the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between its eyes. And he came up to the ram that had the 2 horns, which I had seen standing in front of the canal, and rushed at him in its mighty wrath. And I saw him come beside the ram, and he was enraged at him. And he struck the ram and shattered his 2 horns, and the ram had no strength to withstand him. So he hurled him to the ground and trampled on him, and there was none to rescue the ram from his power. Then the male goat magnified himself exceedingly. But as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, and in its place there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. And out of one of them came forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. And it grew up to the host of heaven, and caused some of the host and some of the stars to fall to the earth, and it trampled them down. It even magnified itself to be equal with the commander of the host, and it removed the regular sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. And on account of transgressions, the host will be given over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice, and it will fling truth to the ground and perform its will and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that particular one who was speaking, how long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply while the transgression causes horror, so as to allow both the holy place and the host to be trampled? And he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the holy place will be properly restored. I'm sure that just makes perfect sense. We all get all of the imagery there.
We don't need to cover
Daniel
that. We can go right on to the
Daniel
next
woke up from that vision thinking, oh yeah, that makes sense. Daniel's got questions. So a ram with two prominent horns. And again, remember the bear? The bear was lopsided, right? Because one side of the bear was bigger than the other. And that represented the Medes and the Persians. And the Persian part of the kingdom was more prominent than the Mede part of the kingdom. So the ram with two prominent horns, the second horn came up bigger, and that was the Persian part of the empire that came up bigger after the Mede kingdom kind of disintegrated. He butts his head to the west, north, and the south. Now, truthfully, the Medo-Persian Empire actually did extend to the east as well, but we don't care about that. That doesn't pertain to what God is worried about as he's revealing to Daniel the things that are taking place pertaining to his people. And so the fact that the Persian Empire did expand into India doesn't fit with this narrative. It just doesn't fit with what we're worried about. So the parts of the world that we care about are the west, the north, and the south. That's the direction where God's people were settled. And the kingdoms that interacted with God's people were settled. None could stand before him. He exalted himself. How many times do we see that when a kingdom becomes powerful, that they exalt themselves, that they become prideful and boastful, and then God ends up humbling them because of their hubris. And so a goat comes from the west, and this goat has a conspicuous horn. And the interesting thing about the goat as he travels is his feet never touch the ground. The Greek army moved so fast across the land that nobody could believe that this army that was off conquering distant lands now all of a sudden was on my doorstep, and it's here to conquer my land as well. They moved so fast and came so quick that nobody could believe it. The conspicuous horn represents Alexander the Great. He was the greatest general ever. He led his army. It was almost always the smallest army going into the battle, and yet they almost always won very decisive victories because of his prowess and their dedication to him. The goat was enraged at the ram. There's historical context for that the Persians in earlier, even as much as a century earlier, had come against portions of the world where the Greeks inhabited and had done damage to them, and Alexander the Great held a grudge. He did not like that portion of his history that the Greeks had been conquered before, and he came specifically to get revenge against the Persians for that earlier defeat.
They were arch enemies during the time of Esther, and during that time they were terrible enemies.
Right.
That's where you get into the Thermopylae and the
Sparta,
Persians,
yeah.
the Persians and the Spartans and yeah.
And so Daniel is seeing this vision in 551 BC. Esther takes place in about 430 BC, 450 to 430 BC, so 100 years after Daniel, and it's her husband who launches attacks against the Greeks, goes all the way to Greece and conquers part of that world. And it's 100 years later then, or a little over 100 years later, that Alexander the Great launches his attack against the Persians. So we're seeing things from Daniel's perspective that are 200 years in the future, but from our perspective, we kind of see it the other way where it looks back. Alexander the Great is looking back on things that haven't even happened yet for Daniel. So the goat was enraged and comes with a vengeance to take revenge for what had happened in the past. Shatters the two horns, does not show any remorse, does not show any mercy in the conquering of the Persian Empire. The male goat then magnifies himself, as we see happening over and over again. And as soon as he has reached the height of his power, as soon as he has made that great victory, his horn is broken. He is destroyed. Alexander the Great died at about the age of 32, 33.
33, I think. There's a little poem thing that compares Jesus and Alexander the Great and what they accomplished by the time they were 33.
Yeah.
But you know what got him?
His pride.
Well, what it was like. Some people think it was like avian flu, bird flu.
Okay.
I mean, the guy's fighting all these battles,
Yeah.
and it doesn't take much to take him down. And once
Yeah.
he was down, that's too bad.
Went by a virus. Didn't wear a mask.
He should have.
All right. The male goat magnified himself, but his horn was broken and replaced by four horns. Alexander the Great died without an heir. He had a son that was born after his death, which that son was immediately assassinated. I mean, just a baby, but somebody killed it because that was Alexander the Great's son, and they didn't want to give up the possibility that they could inherit that kingdom. So his son was murdered pretty much right at his own birth. that horn was replaced by 4 horns. Alexander the Great's 4 generals assumed different areas of his kingdom. From the Egypt was one part of it. There was a kingdom that took over what we would call the Holy Lands or the Promised Land. There was another one that would have been up into Turkey, and then a portion of the kingdom that was actually Greece, Macedonia, that area. So the 4 generals took over, and they kind of got along for a while, but not for very long. A new horn grows that becomes prominent toward the southeast and Beautiful Land. Anybody know what the Beautiful Land would be?
Is that like Beulah land?
Beulah Land.
Beulah and sweet Beulah land?
Yeah, I think Palestine. That would be what we think of as the Holy Lands, the Promised Land. That's where Jerusalem is. That's the Beautiful Land. And we'll talk more about that as we move into the interpretation. The new horn commits terrible acts for 2,300 evenings and mornings. And again, 2,300 kind of comes out being like times and a half time. It's not related as far as like the number of things, but I don't think we're supposed to get out our calendars and say, okay, here's the first sacrifice. 2,300 evenings and mornings would be 2,300 evening and morning sacrifices, which would come out to 1,150 days. I don't think we're supposed to mark off the calendar 1,150 days and say this is the exact amount of time. It was a significant amount of time, but it's a finite amount of time. It's not going to go on forever, even though the people who lived under this time felt like, how is this going to be resolved? How are the terrible acts that are taking place? How is God going to get us out of this? Eventually he did, because God was in control the whole time. And so that's the vision. Daniel's got questions. Daniel doesn't get it, as you can imagine. And so Daniel's gonna get some answers here. And it came about when I, Daniel, had seen the vision that I sought to understand it. And behold, standing before me was one who looked like a man. And I heard the voice of a man between the banks of Ulai, and he called out and said, Gabriel, give this man an understanding of the vision. So he came near to where I was standing, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, Son of man, understand that the vision pertains to the time of the end. Now while he was talking with me, I sank into a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and made me stand upright. And he said, Behold, I am going to let you know what will occur at the final period of the indignation, for it pertains to the appointed time of the end. So there's one appearing as a man approaches Daniel. It could be an angelic messenger. It could be God in some form. We're not identified who this man is, but one appearing to a man, and Daniel recognizes him as somebody that this guy probably has more information than me. So I'm going to ask him some questions. And then he hears a voice calling him Gabriel. And so we see Gabriel at other places. Gabriel is going to make another appearance in Daniel later on in another chapter. And Gabriel is the angel that brought the message to Elizabeth and to Zacharias. And it's the angel that brought the message to Mary that she was going to bear the Lord. So we see Gabriel bringing important messages through the scriptures. And this is the time when Gabriel is bringing an important message. When he comes near, Daniel is frightened and collapses. Some people read this like he faints. He falls upon the ground, falls on his face. And that could be exactly what he does. He just kind of, his knees knock together and he passes out. Gabriel touches Daniel to revive him and stands him up. And then he says this, gives Daniel some information about when this is going to take place. And he says this applies to the time of the end. And a lot of people try to make this into a revelation or a passage about the end of time, the end of the judgment scene is what we're looking at here. But that doesn't fit the context of anything that's being explained in this chapter. It doesn't fit the explanation of the events that Daniel's given. It doesn't fit the events of the vision itself. When it says it refers to the end, it means I'm telling you about how this prophecy ends. This is the end of this prophecy. This is the end of the information that I've been sent to tell you about. How does this story end that you have seen in a vision? Well, I'm going to tell you what the end of this story is. This is not a prophecy about Jesus' return. It's not a prophecy about the end of time.
We haven't even seen that horrible beast in this
Right.
prophecy, and so
Yeah.
this can't be the end of the
Right.
end because we haven't even seen that one kingdom.
Yeah, we know that the final kingdom hasn't even made its appearance, the heavenly kingdom
Yeah, that's
that
the one
that is going to
that's
come anyway.
victorious over the other
And
one.
so it can't refer to anything that distant into the future. It has to refer in context to the end of this prophecy. Daniel 8, verses 20 through 26, Daniel gets some interpretation here, some explanation.
I wonder if we could
You're on Chuck duty, by the way. Don't let him get to that bell.
yeah,
All right.
trip him. I wonder if we can just come up with some theory what he's talking about. I mean, just theorize about. I mean,
I wonder if we have to just kind of make the vision fit with the historical kingdoms that we all know already took place.
well, let's just fit it however we want to.
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
Okay.
The ram which you saw with the two horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. Question:
Okay.
was Media and Persia already in power at this point?
No.
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 This was in the third year of Belshazzar.
Yeah.
This is 10 years in the future that Belshazzar hasn't even died yet. So Media and Persia are not even in power yet. They're kingdoms of Media and Persia, but they're vassal kingdoms of the Babylonian Empire. So this ram with these horns doesn't make sense in Daniel can't be making this up. That's why Daniel doesn't understand what it means. So the ram represents the kings of Media and Persia. And the shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece. Think Daniel's ever heard of Greece?
And well, a lot of skeptics put Daniel way later because it's circular reasoning. They say that, that since he's telling things that are yet in the future, therefore he had to have come later, and they don't accept the fact that he was revealing a prophecy from God.
And so as people who accept the idea of prophecy, accept biblical inerrancy and those kind of things, this is no problem for us as a matter of faith to believe that Daniel is seeing this hundreds of years before it takes place and being given this information. So the shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece, and the large horn that is between his eyes is the first king. We know who the first king of Greece was. It was Alexander. There is no historical dispute to that fact. That's who it is. And the broken horn and the four horns that arose in its place represent four kingdoms which will arise from his nation, although not with his power. Historically accurate that that's exactly what happened. And in the latter period of their rule, when the transgressors have run their course, a king will arise, insolent and skilled in intrigue. And his power will be mighty, but not by his own power. And he will destroy to an extraordinary degree and prosper and perform his will. He will destroy mighty men and the holy people. And through his shrewdness, he will cause deceit to succeed by his influence, and he will magnify himself in his heart. And he will destroy many while they are at ease. He will even oppose the prince of princes, but he will be broken without human agency. And the vision of the evenings and mornings which has been told is true. But keep the vision secret, for it pertains to many days in the future. Okay. The ram with two horns represents the Medo-Persian Empire. We're told that. Daniel, 10 years before the Medo-Persian Empire actually ascends to power, Daniel is told they're coming. The goat represents the Greek Empire. 200 years before Alexander the Great comes to power, Daniel is told the Greeks are coming. The conspicuous horn is the first king. He not named specifically here, but we know who he was. He was Alexander the Great. The four horns represent the Greek kingdom divided after Alexander's death. You can historically research that and find the names of those four generals. There was the Seleucid Empire. There's the Ptolemies. They took over Egypt. The Seleucids took over Judah and Palestine, and then I can't remember the names of the other two.
Well, two eventually gained power over the other two, and it kind of went from 4 to 2.
Right. And the new horn that arises represents a guy by the name of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And he gave himself the name Epiphanes because it means, I forget what it means. It means something like God is ordained, or God, I am God, or something like that. The name God is in there, and he declares himself as a God. The name Epiphanes, by people who did not like him, there was a play on words that with the Greek word that sounds very similar to it, that basically means madman. And they called him Antiochus the madman when he was calling himself Antiochus the God. And so he was brutal. He was horrible. He was like Domitian. And he tried to unite the kingdom that was under his control by saying, you will not worship anybody except for the Greek gods. And so he did things like erected an altar on top of the altar in the temple, the Jewish temple, and there he sacrificed a pig to Zeus. And that was the desecration of the morning and evening sacrifices that took place for a period of time under the reign of Antiochus. You can read historically about him. It was the Maccabean revolt. It was Judas Maccabeus that led the revolt against Antiochus that ended up restoring the daily sacrifice to the temple. They tore down the altar that Antiochus built. They rebuilt an altar according to the biblical dictates of how it should be built. They dedicated that altar with an 8-day period of sacrifices and purification. And that sacrifice, that reenactment of that dedication took place every year in December, and it was called the Festival of Lights, or Hanukkah, and Jesus celebrated that festival in John chapter 7. And so even down to Jesus' times, the things that took place here where Antiochus had desecrated the temple and then Judas Maccabeus restored that worship, Jesus was still commemorating that, celebrating that restoration even in his day. Okay, so Daniel chapter 8, verse 27, last verse of the chapter. Then I, Daniel, was exhausted and sick for days. Understatement. Daniel is early mid-70s when this is taking place. Mm-hmm. This is taking its toll on Daniel. Seeing these visions, understanding these things is tough work. Then he got up again and he carried on the king's business, but I was astounded at the vision and there was none to explain it. Think of the times that Daniel was called on to explain other people's visions, and they were at a loss for what to do and how to understand it. And Daniel comes in and sort of saves the day and says, oh, here's what it means. And they say, oh, okay, now it makes sense. Daniel has this vision, and he's left with questions. He's left with wondering, and there's nobody to explain it to him. He wants to know more. But there's just no more to know because God has revealed all God's going to reveal to him.
Are you saying that 70 is old?
70 is on the older end.
I thought what you were saying there was that he was 70, so he was really
well,
old.
you know, it's not like he was just 49.
Oh, okay.
And then he would have been able to handle that vision a little bit.
Okay, it would have been easier. We don't have time for questions. We've already used up all of our time plus some.
Mike, you did a great job.
Good job, Mike.
Keeping...
Yeah. Think about those visions and what they mean, and thank you very much.
Thank you.